Custer's orders were simple. Surround the village. Let no one escape. His cavalry moved like shadows, a perfect circle of steel closing in. The execution was flawless. The timing, however, was not. The Cheyenne and Sioux were already gone, leaving him to lay siege to ghosts. In the spring of 1867, the American frontier was simmering. Not with the promise of expansion, but with the quiet rage of a dozen broken treaties. In response, the United States government decided to send a message. They dispatched Major General Winfield Scott Hancock with an army of over 1,400 men, complete with infantry, artillery, and the now infamous 7th Cavalry under a young and ambitious lieutenant colonel named George Armstrong Custer. The official purpose of this grand tour was not war. It was, in Hancock's own words, to persuade the Cheyenne and Sioux that the army could punish anyone who misbehaved. It was 19th century diplomacy, where you extend a hand of peace while holding a very large, very loaded cannon behind your back. The justification for this armed parade was a string of violent episodes from the previous summer and fall. Mail stations along the overland routes had been attacked, their staff killed and livestock stolen. Settlers on the Kansas frontier had been murdered in their homes. The official reports laid the blame squarely on the Cheyenne and the Sioux. Yet, no one had been held accountable. The Indian agents, federal employees tasked with managing tribal relations, seemed to know exactly who the culprits were, but punishing them was bad for business, and the agents were, above all, businessmen. They preferred to keep the flow of government goods coming, which lined their pockets far more effectively than justice ever could. So Hancock's expedition was designed as a solution. It was a mobile, heavily armed negotiating team, assembled to address past crimes and, more importantly, to intimidate the tribes out of a promised future war. Intelligence suggested the Cheyenne and Sioux were planning a massive, coordinated uprising along the entire border, scheduled to kick off as soon as the spring grass was high enough for their ponies to graze. To preempt this, Hancock sent out invitations for a grand council near Fort Larned, Kansas, set for the 10th of April. He gathered his forces, joined by Custer and his cavalry, and began the long march, a column of blue-coated steel rolling across the plains with the unsubtle goal of shocking everyone into a state of awe, or at least into a state of compliance. The army arrived at Fort Larned on the 7th of April, a formidable display of American military power ready to talk peace. The Indian agents for the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Apache assured the general that their chiefs had agreed to the meeting. But the Plains had other ideas. On the 9th of April, the day before the Great Council, the sky turned a menacing gray and unleashed a furious blizzard. The temperature plummeted, and a storm of blinding snow and ice buried the landscape. The grand peace talk was postponed indefinitely. Hancock's cavalry and their horses suffered terribly, forced to keep moving constantly just to avoid freezing to death. It was a fitting start to a mission of forced diplomacy. Nature itself seemed to be sending a clear signal that this whole endeavor was a bad idea. When the blizzard finally broke, the landscape was clean, but the political atmosphere was anything but. The Cheyenne and Sioux, whose main village of over 300 lodges lay 30 miles up the Pawnee Fork, showed no enthusiasm for meeting the army. They sent word that they were on their way, but had to stop to hunt buffalo. It was the 1867 equivalent of "I'm in traffic." Hancock, a man accustomed to timetables and direct orders, was not amused. He saw the excuse for what it was, a stalling tactic. He gave them a one-day extension. If they didn't come to him, he would move his entire army to their doorstep. On the afternoon of the 12th of April, a delegation finally appeared. It was two chiefs from the Dog Soldiers, the most famously aggressive and militant band of the Cheyenne, accompanied by about a dozen warriors. They were there to talk, or at least to see what the army was all about. After the requisite ceremonial smoking and a meal, they sat down with Hancock and his officers. The chiefs seemed particularly impressed by the shiny, formal uniforms of the artillerymen. Hancock got straight to the point. He explained his peaceful intentions, but bluntly informed them that, come morning, he was marching his command to their village to hold the council there, with all the chiefs present. One of the chiefs, Tall Bull, gave a meandering reply, complaining about the scarcity of buffalo and heavily implying that some gifts might help the peace process along. The meeting ended with nothing agreed upon, except for the army's imminent arrival. During this tense prelude, a strange side story unfolded. Years prior, the government had agreed to return 2 children taken captive after the Sand Creek Massacre. A young boy was located and sent to Hancock for repatriation. The boy, having grown accustomed to civilized life, seemed content in his new clothes. The chiefs, however, were visibly displeased to see him dressed as a white person. They took him back, and within a year, any trace of his life outside the tribe had vanished. He forgot his English and became as wary of white men as any other child. The first thing his people did was strip off his clothes and wrap him in a traditional blanket. It was a quiet, powerful rejection of everything the army represented. The failed talk and the cultural disconnect only strengthened Hancock's resolve. The chiefs had not come to him, and their excuses were thin. He saw their reluctance not as fear, but as defiance. The decision was made. The next morning, the column would move out. If the Cheyenne and Sioux leaders would not come to the council, then the council, with all its cannons and cavalry, was coming to them. The time for talking was over. The march was about to begin. General Hancock had run out of patience. The morning after the Dog Soldier Council, he ordered his entire column to advance from Fort Larned, marching up the Pawnee Fork directly toward the tribal village. As they moved, his scouts reported seeing small groups of warriors on the horizon, shadowing the army's every move. In the distance, columns of smoke climbed into the sky, signals that something unusual was happening. The soldiers would later learn that the tribes were setting the prairie grass on fire ahead of them, a scorched earth tactic designed to deny the army's horses and mules any grazing near the village. It was a subtle, strategic act of non-violent defiance. This was not going to be a simple march. Before the army could even reach its first campsite, a party of chiefs rode out to meet them, once again promising to hold a full council in the morning. But by 9:30 a.m. the next day, the chiefs were a no-show. Instead, a lone warrior named Bull Bear arrived with yet another excuse, claiming the other leaders were on their way but were taking their time. It was the final straw. Hancock informed Bull Bear that the army was done waiting. They were advancing to the edge of the village and would hold the council there, whether the chiefs were ready or not. The column lurched forward again, and after a few miles, they came over a rise and stopped dead. Stretched directly across their path was one of the most spectacular and imposing military displays the frontier could offer. It was a line of battle, composed of several hundred Cheyenne and Sioux warriors on horseback. They sat motionless, a living wall of opposition, as if to say, "This far and no further." Most were decorated in brilliant war paint and elaborate feather bonnets. They carried red-bannered lances, fully nocked bows, and shields. More concerning to the soldiers were the modern firearms. Many warriors were armed with high-quality repeating rifles and revolvers, weapons provided to them through the bizarre and contradictory policies of the very same government Hancock served. It was a formal challenge, a stunning piece of theater announcing that any further advance would be met with force. Hancock didn't blink. He immediately ordered his own forces into a battle line. The infantry deployed, the artillery crews manned their cannons, and Custer's 7th Cavalry trotted into position, the men drawing their sabers with a sharp metallic ring. For several tense moments, the two armies faced each other in silence, a perfect tableau of so-called civilized and savage warfare. Finally, Hancock and his staff rode forward, waving a white flag of truce. The principal chiefs, including the renowned Roman Nose and the Sioux leader Pawnee Killer, advanced to meet them in the no man's land between the lines. After a round of strained handshakes, Hancock demanded to know why they had presented such a hostile front. The chiefs calmly replied that they did not want war. They wanted peace. A fragile agreement was struck. The army could camp nearby, but no soldier was to enter the village. The chiefs would then come to Hancock's headquarters as soon as the camp was made. The army established its camp about half a mile from the village, which was beautifully situated in a grove of trees along the creek, sheltered from the prairie winds. The crisis appeared to have been averted. The soldiers set up their tents, and a line of sentinels was posted between the two camps to prevent any unauthorized contact. As the sun began to set, 4 Cheyenne chiefs, including Roman Nose, arrived at Hancock's tent as promised. But they brought bad news. They claimed that upon seeing the massive number of soldiers, the women and children of the village had panicked and fled, terrified that the army was there to perpetrate another massacre like the one at Sand Creek just a few years earlier. This was not paranoia. It was a reaction born from recent, horrific trauma. Hancock dismissed their fears, insisting he only wanted peace, and that the families must be brought back immediately. He promised them protection. The chiefs replied that they believed they could get their people to return, but the women and children had a significant head start. To catch them, they would need horses. In what he likely saw as a gesture of good faith, Hancock agreed. He provided the chiefs with army horses to speed up their mission. He was, in effect, personally financing their escape. To keep an eye on things, Hancock instructed his mixed-blood interpreter, Ed Gurrier, to stay in the village and report back every 2 hours on any developments. Hours passed. The army camp settled down for the night, waiting for news. Then, at 9:30 p.m., a horse galloped hard into the headquarters area. It was Gurrier. He was frantic. The chiefs had lied. The entire village was gone. As soon as the chiefs had returned on their new army horses, every remaining warrior had saddled up to leave permanently. They weren't bringing their families back. They were joining them in their flight. They were moving so fast they were abandoning property and even slashing their own expensive buffalo hide lodges to use the material for makeshift shelters on the run. The entire confrontation, the battle line, the peace talk, the story of the frightened families, it had all been an elaborate, brilliantly executed ruse to buy time. Hancock stood stunned. He had been completely and totally outmaneuvered. He immediately summoned Custer. The peace mission was over. The pursuit was about to begin. General Hancock's realization that he'd been outplayed hardened into a new, sharper purpose. He gave Custer his orders directly. Take the 7th Cavalry, move as quickly and as quietly as possible, and surround the Cheyenne and Sioux village. The objective was no longer to talk, it was to contain. Hancock wanted to prevent the departure of a single person, unaware that he was already about 10 hours too late. This operation was to be conducted with absolute stealth. No bugle calls, no loud commands. The army, for once, would have to move like the people they were hunting. It was a mission built on a fantasy, a siege of an already empty castle. The process of waking a cavalry command in total silence began. Custer woke his adjutant, the adjutant woke the company commanders woke their first sergeants, and the sergeants moved through the dark, quietly rousing the troopers. The veteran soldiers of the 7th understood immediately. Without a word or a question, they began to prepare. For a frontier cavalryman, the routine was automatic. The horse came first. They saddled their mounts in the dark before turning to their own gear. While Custer's men prepared to move out, Hancock ordered his remaining infantry and artillery to battle readiness, a backup force waiting for the results of the cavalry's moonlit adventure. The night was mild and the moon, nearly full, was conveniently hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, as if nature itself was trying to shield the soldiers from their dangerous work. No one believed they would get out of this without a fight. If even a single dog barked, they expected the silent village to erupt in a storm of gunfire and arrows. The command mounted up and moved out, a dark mass of men and horses melting into the prairie. All conversation was forbidden, orders were given in whispers, and sabers were carefully secured to prevent the metallic rattle that could give them away. They moved in a wide, sweeping circle, slowly tightening a noose around the village, until hundreds of troopers formed a silent ring, staring through the gloom at the conical white shapes of the teepees. The trap was set. Now they just had to find out if anyone was in it. Custer, along with his interpreter Ed Gurrier, the regimental surgeon, and his adjutant, dismounted and crept toward the edge of the silent village. They crawled on their hands and knees through the damp grass until they reached the outer ring of lodges. Pushing aside the hide flap of the nearest tipi, they peered inside. It was empty. A quick search of several more confirmed their suspicions before the cavalry had even fully closed the circle. The entire population was gone. The escape had been so rushed that a vast amount of property had simply been abandoned. The scene was deeply unsettling. Inside the lodges, campfires had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint red light on the chaos left behind. Elaborately decorated buffalo robes lay where their owners had slept. Parfleshes, the intricately painted rawhide containers used for storage, were full. Iron kettles still hung over the dying fires, many containing the evening meal, left uneaten. The surgeon, Dr. Coates, curious about the contents of one pot, took a taste and declared it surprisingly delicious, speculating it might be turtle or rabbit. Gurrier, the interpreter, glanced into the kettle and corrected him with two simple words. "It's dog." The doctor, overcome with a sudden wave of disgust, made a hasty exit from the teepee. As other search parties moved through the 300 empty lodges, the discoveries turned from eerie to grim. In one dark tippy, Custer's hand brushed against a human foot. When a torch was brought, it revealed a 10-year-old girl, a mixed-blood Cheyenne, who had been left behind. She had been brutally abused by warriors who had reportedly returned to the village after the main party had fled. In another lodge, they found an elderly, infirm Sioux man, also abandoned to his fate. Both were taken back to the army camp for care. In the darkness, there was no way to find a trail, no clue as to which direction the tribes had fled. The pursuit would have to wait for the sun, Hancock was informed, and the decision was made. At dawn, Custer would take the 7th Cavalry and begin the hunt in earnest. There would be no sleep for the 7th Cavalry. As the rest of the army settled into an uneasy rest, Custer's command spent the night preparing for a chase. They didn't know the direction, the distance, or the duration. They only knew it would be fast. Rations of coffee, sugar, and flour were packed. Bedrolls were strapped down tight. Every ounce of unnecessary weight was ruthlessly eliminated, because the officers understood a fundamental truth of plains warfare. To catch an Indian, you had to travel like one. The army had to abandon its cumbersome traditions and adopt the stripped-down, brutally efficient mobility of its enemy. It was a forced evolution, a lesson in humility learned in the dark. All through the night, the camp was a hive of quiet. Blacksmiths worked by the flickering light of candles, their hammers ringing softly as they tightened the shoes on the horses. The real engines of this pursuit. Troopers meticulously cleaned their carbines and checked their ammunition, ensuring every man carried 100 rounds. This wasn't preparation for a battle, it was preparation for a relentless, high-speed hunt across an empty wilderness. Leading the way would be a select group of scouts, a mix of experienced white frontiersmen and allied Delaware Indians, men who could read the subtle language of the plains. The most notable figure among them was a man who was already a living legend. His name was James Butler Hickok, but the frontier knew him as Wild Bill. He was a striking figure, standing over 6 feet tall with the physique of a gladiator. He had sharp, piercing blue eyes and long, untrimmed blonde hair that fell in curls to his shoulders. His style was a strange paradox, combining the meticulous neatness of a city dandy with the casual confidence of a man who was utterly at home in the wild. He was famously quiet and modest, a master with a rifle and a pistol who never needed to boast about it. His reputation did the talking for him. On the frontier, where formal law was a distant rumor, Wild Bill's word was often the only law that mattered. He had killed his share of men but was always cleared. In a place where disputes were settled by the man who could draw his pistol fastest, self-defense was a verdict easily reached when the other party was no longer able to offer a rebuttal. Wild Bill always carried 2 large, ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, the tools of his trade and the source of his authority. He was the embodiment of frontier justice, swift, violent, and final. Before the sun had even begun to hint at its arrival, the pursuit began. On the 15th of April, Custer led his command out of the camp and into the vast, dark prairie. The column halted as the Delaware scouts fanned out, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the trail. The task seemed impossible. A heavy frost coated the earth, masking any tracks and making it difficult to distinguish the main path from the countless hoofprints left by the tribe's massive pony herd. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, a single Delaware scout, standing far out on the plains, raised his rifle horizontally above his head. The signal was clear. The trail had been found. Following it, however, was another matter. The Cheyenne and Sioux had anticipated this pursuit and had planned for it brilliantly. They had not fled as a single group. Instead, they had split their entire village into numerous small parties, each taking a different direction, all with a prearranged plan to reunite much farther north. It was a classic guerrilla tactic designed to scatter their trail and confuse any pursuer. After some time, the scouts managed to identify the main, most heavily used path, and the chase began in earnest. The tribes had a 12-hour head start, but they were encumbered by their women, children, and elderly. The soldiers, lean and unburdened, had a chance to close the gap. Soon, the signs grew promising. They found where the fleeing tribes had crossed a creek, and, a little farther on, the remains of their hastily prepared breakfast. The embers of their cooking fires were still warm. A few abandoned ponies were found, along with some personal equipment belonging to the famous chief Roman Nose himself. The trail was getting hot. As they pushed on, the path became littered with discarded lodge poles and other heavy items, clear evidence that the tribes were shedding weight to increase their speed. To match their pace, Custer made a risky decision. He ordered the slow, heavy supply wagons to fall back with a small escort, while the main body of the cavalry pushed ahead, carrying only what they had on their saddles. Just as it seemed they were finally closing in, the trap sprung. The tribe's own rearguard scouts had spotted the advancing cavalry. The warning went out, and the main body executed their next move. The single trail suddenly exploded, shattering into 100 different, indistinct paths, fanning out across the plains in every direction. The pursuit ground to a halt. As Custer and his men sat on their horses, frustrated and defeated, they saw the final, mocking message from their quarry. Far in the distance, to the north, west, and east, thin columns of smoke rose into the sky. The Cheyenne and Sioux were signaling to each other, coordinating their escape, and announcing that they had once again vanished. After a grueling march of 35 miles, Custer had no choice but to make camp and wait for the dawn. The ghosts had gotten away. Custer's cavalry chased ghosts across the plains, only to find the war had already started somewhere else. Hancock's Great Peace Expedition didn't prevent a conflict. It officially became the reason for one. It was a masterclass in miscalculation, where every promise of peace was just another step toward the very fight everyone claimed they wanted to avoid. History is full of these ugly truths. Subscribe for the next one.